Well, hello everyone, welcome. So, looking at New York City architectural styles and how to research a building. First, we're going to look at the styles, and you should know that with each style, I give you a time frame of dates. These are not hard and fast. One style did not end in 1 year, and then a new style followed the following year. They're just to give you general time frames in which the style flourished in New York at a particular time. And I should also say that that extends into the actual things that we see when we're walking down the street, in that often the row houses, for instance, are vernacular in character, meaning that they're informed by more than one style. And that often has to do with the transitional period in which one style is going out of fashion and another one's coming into vogue. So the first is the Federal style, and this is named after the new republic following the American Revolution. Also distinguished by the ongoing influence of British design on American architecture. In fact, James Fenimore Cooper, a noted novelist, noted that the Americans have not yet adopted a style of architecture of their own. Their houses are essentially English. Except the one distinguishing feature was the British houses were constructed of stone, and here in New York they were constructed of brick, largely. So one of the biggest proponents of this style was the Scottish-born Robert Adam. He was four brothers, but he and his brother James were particularly noteworthy in disseminating the style. And essentially, they started their own practice in London in 1758, and the style that emerged borrowed from Greek, Roman, Baroque, and Byzantine motifs. And in fact, Robert in particular distinguished himself with his designs of country houses, townhouses, and public buildings. He was a consummate designer, architect, interior decorator, interior designer, as well as furniture designer. Really a Frank Lloyd Wright before Frank Lloyd Wright. And some of the things that he pioneered, especially with respect to the interiors, was the use of ornamental plasterwork, borrowing from these various motifs, as well as, if you've seen this medallion, the swags with the bellflowers hanging, that is what we call an Adamesque feature. Also popularized the oval room. I don't know if you've seen some of our older banking halls in New York, where they've got the oval room. So I just wanted to give you an example of these public buildings. This is what you would call the Palladian style, a Palladian plan, consisting of a main section that projects, that's flanked by two receding wings, that is in turn flanked by two projecting pavilions. Yes?
With the Palladian style, is the Met facade with its extensions Palladian style?
Yes, it would be considered a Palladian plan, yes. But then you have the more recent ones, which are kind of
right,
all over the map.
The Hunt and Stanford Place.
Yes,
yeah.
Richard Morrison, yep,
Right.
absolutely. So here in New York, as I was saying, architects for the most part were designing public buildings, they were doing country houses and townhouses. Really only a handful were designing row houses. And the reason being is the speculative builders often considered the engagement of an architect a needless expense, or just for cost considerations. They just, decided to go it themselves. So what you see happening in New York is builders that are looking for references, but not necessarily fully able to kind of come up with a design themselves. And then what you see essentially is the advent of pattern books or builder's guides. These were essentially books that architects would publish to certainly promote their own work, but also enable builders to then have measured drawings where they could basically pick and choose various architectural elements, put them together, and then design their row houses. So these become a very popular means of disseminating a new style. And Asher Benjamin happens to be the first one, publishing in 1797, think his last book was in 1843, and he published 7 pattern books, so he was very influential, especially in promoting the federal style. So in terms of the hallmarks of the style, characterized by modest scale, as you can see, simple architectural ornament inspired by ancient Greek and Roman architecture, 2 to 3 stories high with a basement and an attic half-story with dormer windows. Now, when architectural historians survey buildings like this, the attic story is considered a half-story. So we would call this a 2.5-story row house over basement. Metal or slate peaked roof, usually a pretty severe pitch. Brownstone base, the basement, with the red brick upper facade laid in Flemish bond. And Flemish bond is essentially the long end of the brick alternating with the short end, and so on. So long, short, long, short. Low stoop with wrought iron handrails, fence, and newels. And the newel is the post at the foot of the stoop. 6 or 8 paneled wood entrance door, sometimes with a leaded transom, side lights, and colonnettes. All right, so here we're just giving an example of the panel door. We've got the leaded transom, and I'll show you some examples with the colonnettes. 6/6 double hung windows, 6/6, often flanked by paneled shutters, as we see here. Stone window sills and stone window lintels. Classical wood cornice with dentils, modillions, and moldings. And this is actually just a simple molded cornice, but I'll show you dentils and modillions when we get to that. So the interior plan essentially was the kitchen was typically in the front of the basement. The kitchen was in the rear of the basement. The family room, dining room was in the front. Parlor in the front of the first floor. Formal dining room in the rear. Master bedroom and other bedrooms in the second floor. And then you had servants and children, typically in the attic story. So Greenwich Village has some of the best examples of this style. And they range from the very modest examples inhabited by the shopkeepers, craftsmen, salesmakers, to the very high style versions, which were essentially an embodiment of the aspirational merchant class.
Question, are the dormers always so sort of, high off of the roof? Is that because it's only a half floor there?
Well, yes, that has part of it, and also the pitch of the roof too makes them, yes, gives them sort of that verticality, yeah. Now, funnily enough, these are very modestly pitched roofs, so we're not even getting, I'll show you some other examples where the roof is more severely pitched. So I think they're really highlighted in these photos because the pitch is lower. Notice also sometimes they're segmental arched as opposed to the gable front that we just saw. Here, this is a bracketed and molded cornice. So the molded is the raised area in what we would call the fascia. Also, you notice the lintels here are splayed. That's also a character-defining feature of this style. And then this is a wonderful example of a federal style entrance where you've got the panel door under the leaded transom, you've got the splayed door lintel, you've got side lights, and then you've got fronted by these colonnettes with the Ionic capitals. Also, never last but not least, is the ironwork. In this case, we have the pineapple, which is a symbol of hospitality. And here's one, the same one in context here. Another wonderful door surround treatment. Here we've got this bracketed entablature, and then this kind of sawtooth detail. It's kind of interesting. So that brings us to the Greek Revival. And this is the first revival style in the United States, and really embodies a heightened American interest in Greek architecture, roughly between 1828 and 1848. In fact, one Englishman living in New York proclaimed in 1834, "The Greek mania is here at its height, as you infer from the fact that everything is a Greek temple." from the privies in the back court through the various grades of prison, theater, church, custom house, and state house. So this was a style that was wildly popular here. And does anybody recognize this building?
Federal Hall.
Federal Hall, right. Do you know what this was? So it's called Federal Hall because it's the site in which George Washington was sworn in as the first president. But the building itself replaced Federal Hall. So it was a custom house, and it was designed by a very notable firm, Town and Davis, who worked in the Greek Revival style.
A customs house for Greek spiritualist goods.
So it's anything coming in.
Anything from the gods.
Yes, right. So we already saw how Robert Adam influenced others with his designs and his writings through with the Federal style. But I haven't talked about how Robert Adam himself was influenced. And turns out that he and a cadre of other architects and archaeologists and artists traveled to Pompeii and Herculaneum in the mid-18th century. And upon their return to England, published their findings. In particular, Stewart and Revett published The Antiquities of Athens in 1761, and this book becomes highly influential with respect to promoting the Greek Revival style. And I should say that one of the things that Stewart and Revett talk about is that for years, Roman architecture has been celebrated in England, along with Greek architecture. But when one thinks of the chronology, the Greeks come first, and the Greeks really can be attributed to the purity of the form. And so they essentially established the primacy of Greek Revival, the Greek architecture. But there were other things at play too. And part of it has to do with our country in search of an architectural expression, a new architectural expression for the American identity. So the Greeks are a pretty logical example to look toward. This is about freedom and democracy, which resonates with American audiences. And then coupled with the fact that between 1821 and 1824 was the Greek War for Independence, which aroused great international sympathies, but particularly with Americans. And in fact, the Romantic poet Lord Byron was killed in that war, and so that also just gave it much more of importance. So this becomes a very popular style because of this. So this is the first fully realized Greek Revival building in the United States, and it's in Philly. And one can only imagine, of course modeled on the Parthenon, what sort of effect this must have had on Philadelphians walking, you suddenly see this huge Greek temple before them. And in New York, the Greek Revival motifs start appearing on churches and commercial buildings around 1825. And then we also have the builder's guides that start getting published later in the 1820s that start now popularizing the style. So perhaps no two developments promoted the style in New York City than Colonnade Row, also known as LaGrange Terrace by Seth Geer, and The Row, which is on Washington Square North by an unknown architect. So really this, Seth Geer's Colonnade Row embodied the majesty and certainly opulence of this style. If you can imagine, this was all crafted of marble, double height colonnade. With the base, you've got these torchères that are flanking each of the entrances, these copper wreaths over the doorways. And then you've also got this anthemium cresting, which is the honeysuckle, popular Greek motif, lining the roof line. So this was a pretty power-packed architectural statement. and also lent an unusual amount of cohesion and uniformity to the New York City streetscape. By contrast, the row turns out to be a more practical model for future row house design. Now, this is rather distinctive because of also the rich materials that were employed. This is all Carrara marble here in the base, and also the balustrades here. So quite elegant. Also the fact that it was set back from the street, that was highly unusual for a row house project. Usually they were, much more immediate to the street, much more engaged. As Charles Lockwood said, he wrote Bricks and Brownstones, sort of like the definitive book on the New York City row house, that it lent sort of a patrician grandeur, to the development, this sort of distance with the very dynamic portico, and then the rather flat building behind it. So some of the hallmarks of this style are simple and the bold architectural elements imitating Greek motifs, 3 to 3.5 stories high with a basement, sometimes in the attic story below the cornice, and this is an attic story. Brownstone base with brick upper facade laid in English bond. So we just saw a marble base with the brick upper facade. English bond is the short end of the brick, known as the header, followed by 3 rows of the stretcher, the long end of the brick, and then the short end of the brick. A stoop of medium height with wrought or cast iron handrails, fenced and newels, vertical panel wood door, grand entrance pilasters. So these are actually immediately around the door, not the columns here. Okay. Side lights, you can barely see the outline of the windows flanking the doors, and stone enfranements, which is the big entablature here that you see. 6/6 double hung windows, 6/9 often on the parlor floor, and they're just showing us a 6/6. And then modest molded stone window lintels and sill, and a wood dentiled cornice. So dentils are the small blocks that you see along the cornice, if you think of teeth. So this is really the quintessential Greek Revival row house as it is manifested after the row. As you can see, it's a much more modest design in terms of the surround for the door, but it does have all these hallmarks: the panel door, the pilasters, the side lights, the transom, and then you've got the stone entablature, the stone surround. Also, you note 6/9 here, so they're showing you the 6/9 parlor windows, and then they get steadily smaller as you get to the top story here. Here it is within contacts, and then also just wonderful examples of ironwork as well. So the Gothic Revival, this arises out of some writings by a theorist named A.G.N. Pugin in England. The objective for him was to find an architectural expression for the Anglican Church. So basically, he was dissatisfied with the current church architecture, and he was seeking a new style that would be appropriate for the English church. So where does he go? The medieval times. And Gothic becomes really the mainstay of this, and then gets appropriated by architects that are working here. Does anybody recognize this house? This is called Lindenhurst. It's up in Tarrytown, and I think it was Jay Gould who built this, industrialist. But it's a wonderful example, actually, of this style. Here in New York, we don't see so many examples in terms of residential buildings designed in this style. We see it played out certainly in our Episcopal churches and other Protestant churches, and also, of course, there's what's known as collegiate Gothic, where you have academic buildings that are designed in this style. This is taken from a row in Brooklyn Heights, characterized by architectural elements inspired by organic and natural forms, medievalism, and the picturesque, bold projecting ornament, which is essentially over the door and somewhat over the windows, 3 stories plus basement with a flat roof, as you can see, brick with brownstone trim or full brownstone facade, stoop of medium height with cast iron handrails, fence and newels with elaborate Gothic motifs, and let's see if I can show you in the next slide there. Recessed doorway with paneled wood door with pointed arches with occasional trefoils or quatrefoils. Trefoils are essentially the cutouts that you often see in church pews, where they look sort of like clover. And also, if there's four leaves, that's the quatrefoil. Door surmounted by horizontal hood molding or low Tudor arch, which this is a Tudor arch. It's kind of a flattened Gothic arch. Or combination of the two with foliated spandrel carving. We don't have here would be the foliation, which is really sort of like a leaf-like ornamentation, this foliation. Picturesque hood, stone window lintels. So there are 2 names for these. They're called eared lintels, as in eared, because lintels typically are just on the top of the window and don't come down, or they're called labeled moldings. 2 words for that. Multi-paned double-hung wood windows or multi-paned wood casement windows, and these appear to be casement windows. Plain Greek Revival style or boldly projecting Italian, that's a typo. Just ignore that. Also, I should say that one of these has dates that extend into the 1900s, and that's not correct. If you happen to see, like, ending in 1960, that's not correct. So this is the row that I was talking about, and actually in the ironwork itself, there are Gothic Revival arches as well, Gothic arches. So Richard Upjohn was by far the biggest promoter of this style. He was born in England and he emigrated to the United States. His firm was enormously successful and he was highly prolific across the country designing churches in this style. You may have heard a term in the past, carpenter Gothic. So this is essentially wood churches are designed in this style, as are cottages. You often see little cottages with a lot of gingerbread detail. So that brings us to the Italianate style. So this is a style that has its origins in 16th century palazzos in Renaissance Italy, as well as later in early to mid 19th century clubhouses in England. So I just wanted to say a word about Andrea Palladio because he is highly influential with respect to how this style finally makes its way here in terms of what he has done. He was born in Padua and raised in Vicenza, trained as a sculptor and a stonemason before becoming an architect. In 1541, he traveled to Rome. He was absolutely captivated by its ancient buildings, and he started immersing himself in architectural books. Leon Battista Alberti's books, also the drawings of Vitruvius, who had lived during the Augustan age. These drawings had only been discovered like 60 years earlier from the time that he started studying these books. So this was a huge find because essentially they had these buildings, but they really didn't know much of the story behind it. Palladio was sort of determined to revive an interest in this style. But he was also an architect, so he was also, of course, promoting his work. So he publishes the 4 books of architecture in 1570, and this essentially, at the time, just takes Italy by storm, and then subsequently the world, or I should say Western Europe and the United States by storm. And the books were essentially laid out. The first book had to do with building materials, construction technologies, the classical orders, which you can see an example here. The second book were examples of country villas, promoting his work. The third book were streets, bridges, plazas, and courthouses. And the fourth were examples of temples, with a particular focus on the Pantheon. So this book eventually gets published in England in 1751, and then has subsequent publications. It is still considered textbook for architecture programs throughout the world, actually. So I thought it would be sort of instructive just to see one of Latios' own designs, because essentially what he's doing here is he's taking these classical forms and he's putting his own imprint on it. So basically a Renaissance gloss on classical design. So here we have what we would call a rusticated base, which is a block-like base that is certainly a classical motif. But then you've got these radiating voussoirs, which are these elements surrounding this arch, as well as over the flat arched opening here. And then he's got the mask instead of a keystone here. The balustrades here, that is also a classically informed motif. He's got the molded window surrounds, and then he alternates the pediments. So he's got triangular, segmental arch, triangular, segmental arch. So again, this is his own sort of device. And then you've got the alternating pilasters with the window openings, this cornice-like feature, and then you've got windows above, which again was not a classical thing. This is him dealing with the program, what's actually going on in the building. So in England, the first example of this Italianate or palazzo style is Charles Barry's Travelers Club, and then he follows it with the Reform Club, which, I mean, I look at this photo and I think this looks like something out of Italy, not out of England. And then here in New York, the first commercial example is the A.T. Stewart store, which is located on the northeast corner of Chambers Street and Broadway. Also houses the New York City Department of Buildings, the Manhattan branch. One can only imagine this was also sort of the first department store of its time. So the fact that customers were coming into a very new form of a building, and then of course being blown away by the merchandise that was inside of the building as well. Now, unfortunately, it's had a lot of alterations over the years, so we only sort of get a semblance of, this Italianate motif with the cornice here, and then these entablatures that we see above. But this is a marble facade, and then it's got a cast iron storefront. Then an example from Bernard Lefebvre's Builder's Guide, in which he actually coined the name Italian style. He's the first to coin it. And he's showing us an example of a bank building that was built at Fulton and Concord Streets in Brooklyn. But he's also giving us examples of row houses, which is rather interesting as well. So in terms of the character-defining features of the style, characterized by elaborate, bold, projecting ornament with an emphasis on repetitive forms, 2 to 4 stories high with a brownstone basement, usually a full brownstone facade, a high and wide stoop with elaborate cast iron handrails, balusters, fence, and newels. The baluster, you didn't catch it from that former, are the posts within the balustrade. Okay? The fence and newels, deeply recessed doorway with heavy protruding door hood and console brackets. The console is like a shelf-like element, often seen on the parlor window, at the parlor window sills. People put plants on them. So the brackets would be what's holding up the consoles. Round-headed double-leaf doors with heavily molded arched panels, large double-hung 2/2 or 1/1 wood windows, sometimes with heavy muntins, and that's the bar that runs down vertically in the center, to imitate casement windows. I can only think that part of the allure of the Italian style was to have the Italian windows that open up as opposed to the double hung. So these are actually double hung windows, but they have this muntin bar that makes them look like casement windows. Heavy projecting stone window lintels and sills, sometimes resting on brackets. These don't have brackets, but heavy. Or full window enfranements, which means that there's a total window surround, like I showed you with Latios building. Heavy, imposing, projecting cornice embellished with moldings and supported by rectangular or scroll-shaped brackets. So often you see these scroll-shaped brackets. Often you walk down the street, you look at a house, and there are virtually no clues as to what style it is. To this I say, look to the cornice, because often that's the only thing that survives. And in fact, there is quite a distinction between an Italianate cornice and these other cornices, the Ephemeral and the Greek Revival style. So this is an example of an Italianate mansion. This is the Salmagundi Club, which is located near 14th Street. And this particular area near Fifth Avenue, as well as Madison Square near Fifth Avenue, were in particular a place of extensive development of these Italian mansions. For those that could not afford a mansion, there were the row houses. St. Luke's Place actually has some wonderful examples. Also, this is really anomalous, I would say, to see a brick Italian row house. They really are normally brownstone. So that's kind of interesting too about the row. But you can see this very imposing door hood with these foliated brackets. You've got this pediment. Also, look how recessed the door is. Then you've also got a very tall and narrow house. Part of that had to do with the fact that there was an economic recession going on during this period, and in fact, the developers would build an additional house within the same size lot as the Federal and the Greek Revival houses in order to maximize the coverage. So it resulted in narrower houses, but they built higher. So these have generous ceiling heights, but they're often narrower than the buildings that, the row houses that precede them. Compounded with this brownstone facade, it makes for a very sort of brooding sort of experience to see these, especially because the cornices are typically heavier, bracketed, very ornamental. So this is a style that's very flamboyant and ornamental. And
I have a question about this, maybe you can help me out.
Sure.
Is it Rutland that has those all the limestone houses? So could it be limestone too? Because they're Italian, ain't those ones?
Yeah.
But they're sort of, like some of them are kind of rounded in the front and they're all Italianate. It's a whole block of Lefferts Gardens that's...
Oh yes, right. No, those would be considered, they're more in the neoclassical vein because they're also later than this. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. There's rows and rows of those houses. Yeah. Also, just note the wonderful ironwork as well. Kind of unusual. You see these circles in surrounded by these bars. They're kind of like wreaths. It's a popular motif that you see also in the ironwork in Brooklyn as well. Some more examples. Here you can see really very tall and narrow, the big cornice with foliated brackets and the molded fascia here. And then we would call these segmental arched entablatures. If you just think of a segment, it's a little segment of an arch as opposed to a large arch. And then these are bracketed sills. See, just little brackets. They're more decorative than they are structural. And then the wood paneled double leaf door. And also you've got this arched surround and then the portico in front of it. So there's a real sort of dynamism to these houses. Very, what we would call an active facade where you've got projecting and recessed elements. So the Anglo Italian is really a derivative of this particular style. And this was popularized by Alexander Jackson Davis. He was the first one to design in this style. So this, as you can see, look at the stoop. Look how low that stoop is. This is what we call an English basement plan, where the basement is below, subterranean. Not a lot of light coming into the basement in this particular type of design. And then you've got, this is the parlor floor, actually. And this typically might be like a library in the front of the building. You've got a really wide vestibule here. And then often you have this railing that is meant to sort of mask people's viewing into the building as they're passing by, passers-by. So it's almost like for a privacy thing. So some of the hallmarks, 3 to 5 stories high, narrow width, rusticated brownstone basement and first story with smooth brownstone or brick upper facade, a low stoop, round-headed double-leaf wood door with arched panels, as they show here, a round arched door surround, which we just saw in that Italian example as well, square-headed round arch or segmental-headed window openings, 2/2, as these are, or 1/1, or multi-paned wood windows, simple brownstone window lintels and sills, a bracketed cornice with an arched fascia. And this particular detail, that's definitely a character-defining feature. You don't see that in other styles. You don't see it in the Italian end. But so I would say the two things with this particular style that you'll notice is low to the ground with the stoop, and also this different material base than you've got in the upper floors, and this arched fascia. And there happens to be on this block, as you leave here tonight, if you can see across the street, there's a whole row of these. A little altered, but all the same. So here's an example on West 12th Street. So that brings us to Second Empire style, and this is a style that originated under Napoleon III, credited certainly to Jules Mansard, of the mansard roof that we see right here. This is a very easy style to discern because it's essentially an Italianate row house with a mansard roof. So here it's similar to Italianate style, 3 to 5 stories high, brownstone facade, a wide stoop with classically inspired handrails, fence and newels, mansard roof, usually slate with iron cresting. So if this had iron cresting, that would be a detail that would line the top of the roof. An iron-like fence. It's very low. And then we've got a doorway with stone pilasters, consoles, and segmental arched pediment, which is this up here. Just some examples. This is a very high-style version of a Second French Empire. And then we've got these more vernacular versions in Brooklyn. So the Neo-Grec is rather interesting because it is a direct outgrowth of the industrial age. It's characterized by repetition, mechanization, angular forms, geometric configurations in terms of the elements. It's also informed by the advent of steam-powered technology, which now allows builders to expedite the building process. And so when you see things like these carvings, these are done by machines. They're part of what that's all about. The style is popularized by Richard Morris Hunt. He's the first architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris is considered sort of the prototype of Neo-Grec design. That being said, as it makes its way to America, it has a different sort of aesthetic to it, which is characterized by all those things I was just saying. So here we see characterized by extremely stylized classical details, angular forms, and incised or engraved detailing formed by mechanical stone cutting. 3 to 5 stories high with the basement. Brownstone and or brick facade with simplified ornament, including single line incised cuttings in the stone, which we saw just single line here. High stoop with massive, heavy, angular cast iron handrails, fence, and newels. Massive door hood and enfrainment with angular decorative elements resting on stylized brackets. So again, this treatment. Double leaf wood entrance door with angular ornaments. Stylized angular incised window surrounds. 2/2, as these are, or 1/1 double hung windows. Projecting angular bays. We all know what a bay window is. This is not showing us that. Projecting wood or metal cornice resting on angular brackets. So this is one thing that I've noticed is often I've not been able to spot this style in terms of what's remaining on the facade. But then when I look at the cornice, you see that very angular repetition of brackets. And that is really a giveaway. So this becomes a very popular style for tenement construction because it's easy and cheap to build with the mechanization. And so it's a lot of the tenements that we see in the city are designed in this style. You may notice that there's this detail here where the lintels are connected by this band and the sills as well. We call those lintel courses. That's the entire band that runs across the connects the lintels. And sill courses, so the sills that are connected by a single, we call it a string course. That's also a character-defining feature of the neo-Greek style. It's just you don't see that on row houses so much as you see them on these tenement buildings. And then here's an example of a row. I know it's difficult to see, but if you get a sense of just how heavy these newel posts are, how angular, and then also just very heavy treatment of the balustrade, the balusters, very imposing. And then you can see this sort of abstraction of a pediment here. And here, it's flush with the building. It's not even projecting at all. So this has no active facade. This is an inactive facade. It really is just all flush. And also this, too, is not projecting terribly, but also has those incised carvings as well. Despite having the words Queen Anne in its name, this style has nothing to do with the reign of Queen Anne. It's actually meant to evoke sort of the free association of Renaissance elements. And this was a style that was popularized by a British architect named Norman Shaw in the 1850s, and then makes its way over here in the US later in the 1870s, and particularly gains stride momentum in the 1880s. Characterized by asymmetrical massing of forms and details, you can see this sort of asymmetry here. Contrast of varied materials, colors, and textures. Eccentric details, often with classical or Renaissance precedents, and often mixed with Romanesque Revival style forms. So it's almost like everything but the kitchen sink here. Use of terracotta, 3-sided projecting bay windows, whimsical juxtaposition of window pane size, usually double hung windows with small paned upper sash. And often the small paned upper sash will contain stained glass. Wrought iron used at the doorways and the railings. L-shaped stoops or straight stoops. So either they come down straight or they're boxed like this. Multi-paneled wood doors. Sure. Gabled roofs covered with tiles or slate featuring dormers and chimneys. So again, we've got this sort of like gable-like profile here, different dimensions. Sometimes you'll see chimneys on the ends, and then covered in slate or tile. This is really sort of a storybook style, as you can see, very fanciful. And often in the roof lines of this particular style, you see a lot of variety from row house to row house. So that's one big giveaway that you're looking at Queen Anne when you see that differentiation among the roofs of a particular row. And then here, this one is incorporating a Gothic arch, and then really fanciful up here with this treatment. And then you can see also this very heavy use of the stone in the first floor and the basement of the building. That was the Romanesque that they were alluding to in that description. By contrast, the Renaissance Revival, which really becomes popular as part of the American aesthetic arts movement, is more symmetrical and ordered, and distinguished often by this foliate ornamentation that you see in spandrels, which are typically what you find under the windows, or these bands, also over the front doors as well, and also stained glass you'll often see with the Renaissance Revival. So characterized by simple, restrained Renaissance design forms and an interest in classicism, 2 to 3 stories high, brownstone, limestone, or light-colored brick facade, subdued classical ornament concentrated around the door and window openings, which, as we can see here, applied detail includes motifs or wreaths, baskets of fruit, garlands of flowers, the L-shaped stoop, often with 2 landings, entrance surround featuring a full stone enfranement, wood double-leaf doors with glazed openings, sometimes with iron grills, and a simple iron cornice with Renaissance-inspired elements. So actually, in thinking about the row houses you were talking about in Prospect Lefferts, they're Renaissance Revival. Yeah. And if they're built actually in the early part of the 20th century, we call them Neo-Renaissance, which is kind of more streamlined. So this is an example of a pair of French Renaissance Revival row houses. So you can notice how this is a fully symmetrical development, unlike what we just saw with those pairs of the Queen Anne's, where so much variety going on. And these are very, really formal and ordered. In this case, again, just not as fanciful as we saw before. And then we also see the repetition of the various rows, individual houses. These. So the Romanesque Revival is based essentially on 11th and 12th century Tuscan forms, where the materials are very expressive of the structure, characterized by very heavy treatment. So heavy forms, asymmetry, and polychromatic materials, and a straightforward use of materials and expansion of structure, tonal and textural juxtaposition of material, rock-faced brownstone, which is typically found in the basement and sometimes the first floor level, granite, limestone, elongated red, yellow, and brown brick, and terracotta, often in the upper floors, use of permanence of stones to evoke a sense of solidity, Byzantine-style carved ornament, spiny interlaced vegetal forms, abstract patterns, grotesque human and animal heads, massive arches, deeply recessed, and this is not a round arch door, and window openings, multi-paneled wood double door. This is elaborate stained glass transom lights, typically here in the parlor windows, and Spanish tile roofs up above. Although this is really a cornice here, so it's not giving us a peak roof with the Spanish tile. So here's some examples. You can see these Roman arches throughout, and then also the rock-faced brownstone, and just the different colors of the brickwork too. This is an excellent row. You can just see very heavy, imposing lower floors, and then the Romanesque arches here.
What makes those arches Romanesque? Just that they're heavy-handed?
So the thing of it is, it's interesting because there are other styles that incorporate Roman arches, because the Roman arch is basically a regular arch, as we know an arch. it is really the repetition that you find in this particular style that you can identify it and sort of distinguish it from those other styles that may have one or two, but not throughout. Yeah. But these are definitely Romanesque, like especially when they're very wide, they're kind of squat. These openings, by the way, these contain, originally contained stained glass in them. They're quite beautiful, these buildings. And also just notice this kind of detail too, very imaginative, unconventional for a row house. So the Beaux-Arts style really becomes popular after the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, which was held in Chicago. It was the World's Fair. And at this particular World's Fair, there was a collaborative attempt by a cadre of leading American designers to come up with a model for the new American city. And where do they look but the Western European countries and the classical buildings for inspiration? So the Beaux-Arts becomes a style that is essentially borrowing from these classically inspired forms in a rather flamboyant manner. This was nicknamed the White City because in fact all the buildings were white, but it also comes out of the Progressive era where there's a real concentrated effort at urban reform and to find architecture that can be both spiritually and morally uplifting. So interesting to note that Richard Morris Hunt was one of the architects on the team here. He who popularized Neo-Grec also popularized Beaux-Arts style here. So this is characterized by an academic classicism, symmetry of design, and an ordered uniform appearance. 5 stories high, steep mansard roof with ornate dormers, which this is pretty ornate for a dormer, or flat or low-pitched roof. White marble, limestone, or a light-colored brick facade. Bold, 3-dimensional stone carving. Use of cartouches as ornament. So these are cartouches, these kind of plaques you see. Often they have the date of the building or the name of the building in them. Lacks a high stoop. Entrance door is 1 or 2 steps above the sidewalk, so similar to this Anglo Italian. Main floor is often 1 floor above the entrance and usually has large windows and balconies, as this does, the balcony. Double hung and casement wood windows, so these are double hung. Curved or 3-sided projecting bay windows. I'm not sure if that's a bay or not. they're calling the Orioles bays, clearly from the other example too. Sheet metal cornice with console brackets embellished with friezes. Not so much here. We're not seeing the frieze, but that would be the fascia if it had an ornament in it. So New York City, from Grand Central Terminal to here the New York City Chamber of Commerce to these apartment buildings up in Morningside Heights. Just a rather flamboyant use of classical forms. If you know the U.S. Custom House at the foot of Bowling Green, that is a textbook example of the Beaux-Arts style. So the last one we're looking at is Colonial Revival. And this is a style that essentially has 3 iterations and counting, because we even see it today. And today we call it maybe neo-traditional, when you see a housing subdivision designed in this style. But the first iteration, which is what I'm talking about tonight, roughly 1880 to 1930, it's first introduced in 1876 with the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. So country celebrating its 100th-year anniversary, and one of the models there is a replica of Mount Vernon, George Washington's house, which becomes a model for very wealthy business people intent on building their houses. So they actually replicate the entire house. But then it also has other iterations, which is characterized by a fusion of not just colonial, but also Georgian, federal, and Greek motifs. So the first iteration is rather high style. And here it says use of colonial design motifs, combining elements from the Federal and Greek Revival styles. It also does incorporate Georgian, symmetrical red brick facade laid in Flemish bond, high stoop or simple steps, stone trim around the doorway and windows, 6 or 8 paneled wood door with leaded fanlight or rectangular side lights and transom. Not really seeing it here. Simple iron handrails and fences, multi-pane double-hung wood windows. Classical details often include urns, festoons, and broken pediments, delicate, slender moldings, and simple cornice. This is a simple, we would call this a dentiled or denticulated cornice here. So the pediment, or what we would call a gable front profile, that is a very popular colonial revival motif. And then also you can see these kind of 3-paneled stone door lintels, 3-paneled stone window lintels, also colonial revival motif. And that Flemish bond brick. So essentially, if you're looking at a very early house, very early, we would be looking at the Federal style, which incorporates the Flemish bond. But if you're looking at a house that's, or an institutional building designed in the 20th century, early 20th century, and it's got this high style to it, it's probably going to be a colonial revival. So here are some examples of the high style. Here's a row, Albemarle Terrace in Brooklyn, and then we've got this institutional building in 1930. Now there is another style called neo-federal, where there is sort of an overlap here, because this is using a lot of the federal style elements. You see this kind of splayed keystone here, but again, the pediment and also just the brick, very high style. Does anybody have any questions about styles before we move on to researching a building? So I realize it's a lot to take in. Just want to see where we are. So how does research buildings? All right. So one thing I just wanted to say about